Know the difference with Annex Wealth Management? You know, the fact is some assets are better than others to leave behind. Certain assets can cause arguments between family members or may have hidden costs. I've got a list of 6 things you might not want to inherit due to complications associated with them. Let's go over that with a couple of our teammates. First, Amy Kiiskila, welcome back.
Thanks, Danny.
Amy is Director of Wealth Strategy at Annex. She's also an attorney, CPA, and a CFP. Deanne Phillips is here. Hey, Deanne.
Hello, Danny.
Deanne Phillips is Director of Client Learning and Development, CFP, and a CDFA at Annex. What might you not want to inherit? The first on the list is a timeshare. How come?
Well, these contracts of timeshares can actually last for decades. And believe me, as a wealth manager, notoriously difficult to get out of. And sometimes people don't realize that the kids are going to inherit the maintenance. You really want to begin to have that discussion while you're still living, hopefully, about do they actually want it?
Yeah, it's essentially a form of vacation ownership. So you can pass it on. A couple of options for people to think about. If the kids say, I just don't want or need or am able to use the timeshare, you can work with timeshare companies to take a look at what exit resources they may have. You can hire out for help. There are attorneys or timeshare exit companies, although be very careful. Do your research to make sure that that company is reputable. Work with your financial advisor, of course, to think about the various options.
6 things you might not want to inherit. Next, potentially valuable collectibles.
I love it that you say valuable collectibles, Danny, because that's the variable word. And we all potentially have different meanings associated with that word. To some, valuable means emotional attachment, and to others, they fixate on what they originally spent on the object. In both cases, that might not relate to the market value currently, but people don't take into consideration things like depreciation or if it's a use asset that they're going to use for a while, and also what the current market dictates. All of these can impact supply and demand and impact the price you would get on something. If you do think that something has a true ongoing value, like a wine collection, for example, get an appraisal and see who in the family would want it and figure out a way to pass it along.
Understanding the value is really, really important. So when mom or dad dies, particularly in some cases, they may have to file a federal estate tax return. You will have to have your valuable collections appraised for that purposes. Also think about what that looks like from an estate planning. So if mom or dad didn't specify who's going to get that collection, it's going to be up to the executor or trustee to kind of make that determination in terms of what happens to the collection, who's going to take it over.
6 things you might not want to inherit. Next one, firearms.
They aren't the kind of property you just hand over to the next person. In a lot of cases, there's proper registration or permits. The rules can vary from state to state about the passing along of firearms, depending upon your residence and the type of firearm that it is, obviously, too. And, not everybody in the family may feel that same way about it, but it certainly is something that the executor of the estate would want to have their arms around. Are there firearms and were there collectibles like this in the household?
They're certainly more complex than other assets. The rules for transferring, it's going to depend on where you live, what type of gun it is, and who you want to pass it to. Federal law, state law, local laws are come into play, particularly if you are going to be giving them to somebody who lives in a different state. So always needing to make sure that that person can own those firearms. Really good idea if you are the executor or trustee. First of all, secure all of the firearms, make sure they're inventoried, and work with licensed gun dealers and an attorney to make sure you dot your I's and cross your T's.
Amy Kiiskila, Director of Wealth Strategy. Deanne Phillips, Director of Client Learning and Development. 6 items you might not want to inherit. Oh, sure. Operating businesses. That's a can of worms, and that's a whole nother conversation.
It's a whole nother. We could spend all day talking about this one. Sometimes that transition of that operating business is pretty seamless if the previous generation has done good planning during lifetime and communicated that to the family. However, we do see plenty of circumstances where that planning hasn't occurred. Families left trying to figure things out, figuring out how to keep the business running, how you're going to value that business, and where that ownership interest is going to go.
6 items you might not want to inherit. Vacation properties, really.
Well, inherited vacation properties are another potential landmine because, especially if they're out of state, they can create something called ancillary probate potentially if they're not in a trust. Here's the thing, too. not everybody wants it. Just because you adore going there, maybe part of the family, maybe they all love it, but maybe only part of the family can afford the maintenance and upkeep.
That's right. So if you are thinking about passing down that vacation property, some issues to consider is how will it be owned? We see families use things like LLCs or trusts to consolidate the ownership and management. Allocating time, what if everybody wants it over the 4th of July? Deanne, as you mentioned, expenses. So there's taxes to be paid, insurance, maintenance, sometimes capital improvements have to be done. And you also have to think about that exit plan going forward. What if a family member wants to opt out of being a part of the vacation property?
6 items you might not want to inherit. Our final item, any physical property, especially with sentimental value. And kind of back to our first point, Deanne, where depends on how you're valuing these things.
It sure does. Grandma's pie plate. Everybody remembers Thanksgiving around it, and they all want it. So devising some sort of soft way to divide up assets can be really important. It's a very common, I see, Amy, not necessarily a legal way when people say, take tape, put your name on the item, right? But that's not a legal way to transfer ownership.
Yeah, thinking about the legal way, how it integrates with your estate planning, really important. You can write into your estate plan, your will or your trust, what specific items you want to go to specific people. Many states will even let you do a separate list that you can update from time to time. And remember that if you have not designated who's going to get certain items, again, it's going to be that trustee or executor's role to determine where items go or if they're going to be sold.
We can help you figure it out, folks. AnnexWealth.com. Click that Get Started button. Amy Kiiskila, Director of Wealth Strategy at Annex. Thank you.
Thank you.
Deanne Phillips, Director of Client Learning. Thank you.
My pleasure.